The Israeli military says 3 hostages accidentally shot dead by the Israeli army on Friday in Gaza were carrying a makeshift white flag when the incident happened. Their killings have shocked the country, with hostage relatives voicing anger over the shootings and demanding the government do more to secure the release of their loved ones.
After weeks of being held hostage in Gaza, Samer Fouad al-Talalka is laid to rest in his hometown of Hura, Israel. Killed not by those holding him captive, but by his country's own army. Samer is one of 3 hostages mistakenly shot by Israel's military during its offensive in northern Gaza. The men reportedly emerged shirtless from a building, waving a white cloth on a stick. Soldiers mistook them for militants and fired. According to a military probe, one of the men also cried out to the soldiers in Hebrew. Israel's prime minister has called the incident heartbreaking.
It broke my heart, broke the entire nation's heart, and our hearts go to the families at this tough hour. We will learn these lessons, we will apply them, and we will not let go of the military and political effort to release the hostages.
At a protest here in Tel Aviv, people are devastated at the Israeli military's mistake. They are demanding that the government do more to secure the release of hostages, about 100 of whom remain in Gaza. Ophir Weinberg is waiting for her cousin to be rescued. She tells us it has been a nightmare.
Today we got another body. A woman that was alive when she got in, and she is now dead. Every day we get new names of people. We don't have any more times. We need to be proactive about this. Israel should put a deal on the table that Hamas could not deny.
Like many here, Ophir feels that the Israeli government is not doing enough to save the hostages.
Of course they are not doing enough, because if they would do enough, he will be here, and we will not be talking.
Raz Ben Ami was recently released by Hamas. She pleaded for the safe return of her husband.
Military action on its own will not save the hostages' lives. Swapping the hostages for prisoners is urgent and critical. The war cabinet alone will not bring about the release of the hostages alive.
Despite growing calls of that kind, the Israeli government insists the best way to ensure their return is to keep up its military pressure on Hamas. People here do not agree.
Joining us now from Jerusalem is our correspondent, Tanya Kramer. Tanya, hostages have died before in difficult circumstances. Now the IDF is directly implicated. Has this added to the already significant pressure on Israeli leadership?
Well, there's certainly a lot of anger and disbelief over what happened, especially now that there are more and more details coming out of this preliminary investigation by the army over this incident where the 3 hostages were killed. And as we heard, where they were actually waving a white cloth or sort of white flag, indicating or trying to show who they actually are. But saying this, there's also some support here being voiced to the troops. But there's a lot of discussion and debate going on how could this have been averted, and this certainly adds to the scrutiny and also to the pressure on the government as to how they handle this hostage crisis. And we've been hearing again from the Hostage and Missing Families Forum. This is one of the main groups speaking for those who still have loved ones as hostages in Gaza. They actually put out a statement last night that they will put up and step up their pressure on the government to push for a new deal, but also they've been saying that the return of the hostages in coffins would not be seen as a victory.
What about the political climate there? Is there movement on returning to the negotiating table with Hamas?
Well, on the one hand, of course, the government cannot ignore the public mood over what is happening, in the hostage crisis. But on the other hand, we are not seeing a change in the course of the government actions. Actually, we've heard again Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying on Saturday night that military pressure is necessary for returning the hostages, but also for achieving victory, meaning for eliminating Hamas. This is a stance that we've been hearing now for weeks from the government. At the same time, Hamas put out a statement last night saying that there will be no negotiations unless there's an end to what they call the aggression, unless there's an end to the fighting. So it's unclear at the moment how this gap will be bridged by the main mediators such as Qatar.
Dynamic situation as always. DW correspondent Tanya Kramer, many thanks.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus is a spokesman for the Israeli military. I asked him to explain how the killings could have happened when the hostages were shirtless and carrying a white flag.
Yes, hello, good night. Thank you for having me on your show. It was what we understand from the preliminary investigation that was overseen by very senior officers in the IDF is that the firing by the IDF soldier towards the former Israeli hostages as they were approaching was a incomplete violation of the rules of engagement. It was contrary to the rules of engagement and it shouldn't have happened. And what we are investigating is why, what were the factors that led to that decision being made. And of course, extremely important for the future to give guidelines to our troops in Gaza, how to prevent that from happening in the future in Gaza, because we may find ourselves in a similar or another type of situation like this in the future.
So you mentioned that this incident was outside the IDF's rules of engagement, but can you perhaps explain what this means in more detail?
Yeah, it was contrary to the rules of engagement. It shouldn't have happened, and it was a mistake by the soldier who fired. But it's very important to understand that the environment where our soldiers are operating is a very dynamic and chaotic environment, where our enemy, Hamas, constantly uses civilian clothing and civilian facilities in order to fight. We have encountered countless Hamas combatants dressed in civilian clothing. So therefore, our troops are constantly ready and perceive almost everything as a threat. And as such, that was probably something that led to the misunderstanding here and this mistake. We have seen attempts by Hamas to use voice recordings of Hebrew-speaking people, including children, in order to trick the IDF into going into buildings and alleyways in order to be attacked by IEDs. So, of course, it's a mistake what the soldiers did on the ground. But once you understand what environment our soldiers are operating in, then you can start understanding why it happened. But most importantly for us is to make sure that we learn lessons quickly and that we disseminate those new guidelines for the troops so that we can prevent this. And I can assure you that there is nothing that our soldiers want more than to return our hostages home.
And now, what kind of consequences, if any, could the soldiers who shot those hostages then face?
Yeah, since it's under investigation, I cannot go into any details what will happen. I can only say that, of course, the commanders in the IDF understand that this wasn't something that was done with any hostile intent, that this was a mistake, and it will be addressed as such. And beyond that, I can't, discuss something that is part of an open investigation or an review. Our focus is to continue fighting, to defeat Hamas, and to return our hostages home alive, and to end the war as quickly as possible.
But we have to acknowledge that even after all of these weeks of the IDF fighting in Gaza, more than 100 hostages are still being held by militants in the territory. And as you know, there's growing criticism among the Israeli public. Many people say that fighting is not going to get the hostages back and that what's needed are negotiations once again with Hamas. So does the IDF perhaps need to change its strategy?
I actually don't think that is contradicting. I think that negotiations can continue while there is fighting. And we in the IDF believe that the fighting on the ground and the continued pressure on Hamas leadership and the fact that they are threatened and that we are taking out commanders, militants, infrastructure, and that we are slowly but steadily dismantling their infrastructure is contributing to the willingness of Hamas to give up the hostages that they have been holding on to for more than 70 days, including 17 women and children. 132 hostages are still in Hamas captivity. And we believe that it is what is needed is continued pressure on Hamas in order to get them to understand that there will not be a way out for them and that they need to give up the hostages. Having said that, of course, the IDF welcomes, and that is done by other organizations in Israel and by the Prime Minister's office. The IDF welcomes any negotiations that can bring back additional hostages, and we have said very clearly that we are for that as well.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus from the Israel Defense Forces, many thanks indeed for taking the time to speak to us on DW.
Thank you for having me.